Good evening, everyone. My name is Peter Murphy from the Politics in the Pub Committee. The topic tonight is from the Wikileaks files: international justice, diplomacy, and the United States of America. We've got two really fine speakers. The first is Linda Pearson. She's an activist and writer. She has written about Cablegate. She's written for the Green Left Weekly on a variety of subjects, including Australian foreign policy and US interference in Ecuador. Linda has a chapter in the new book, The Wikileaks Files, The World According to US Empire, on the US relationship with the International Criminal Court. She's also been actively involved in campaigning to defend Wikileaks itself and Julian Assange, although not so recently. And she's written about the Australian government's treatment of Julian Assange. And she's fresh from an appearance where he came by Skype to the Wheeler Centre in Melbourne last week. So the whole story of WikiLeaks and Julian is quite alive here.
Thank you very much for having me here tonight. So as Peter said, I've written on quite a wide variety of topics based on Cablegate, which is US diplomatic cables published by WikiLeaks. So I've decided to focus on one subject tonight just so I can go into a bit of depth: the International Criminal Court. This is what I've written about in the book, The Wikileaks Files, as Peter mentioned, but I'm going to try and add as much new information as possible in my talk tonight. So when I'm talking about Cablegate, I'm talking about the 251,000 US diplomatic cables released by WikiLeaks in 2010 and 2011. Since then, WikiLeaks has added over 2 million more cables to that database, but they're from a much earlier period, from the 1970s. The cables I'm talking about tonight are mostly from the first decade of this century. So the cables on the International Criminal Court, I think, provide an interesting case study of how diplomacy is conducted in the US empire, how the US government goes about trying to get what it wants. In relation to the International Criminal Court itself, I think the cables help us understand why the court is failing, in my opinion, in its stated aim of ending impunity for the perpetrators of atrocities and thus contributing to the prevention of such crimes. In its 13-year history, the ICC has only indicted Africans and has only successfully prosecuted 2 individuals. So I'll just start by giving you a few basics about the International Criminal Court. I'm not going to attempt to explain it fully because that would take a long time. So the court was created by the 1998 Rome Statute, which is a multilateral treaty with 123 member states. The court has jurisdiction to prosecute individuals for the crimes of genocide, serious war crimes and crimes against humanity, and it won't have jurisdiction to prosecute the crime of aggression until 2017. The court has an independent prosecutor, so it was designed to be free from political influence. But the court relies on the cooperation of states to investigate cases, and without its own police force, the court must rely on states to enforce its arrest warrants. As the cables I'm going to mention illustrate, the ICC's development has inevitably been shaped by the power dynamics of the international system in which it operates. So cases or situations, as they are called, can be referred to the court by member states, state parties to the Rome Statute. The prosecutor herself can also initiate investigations on the basis of complaints from groups and individuals. And the UN Security Council has the power to refer cases to the court, and this has happened twice, in the case of Sudan in 2005 and Libya in 2011. So after the ICC prosecutor conducts a preliminary investigation into a situation, she may only open a full formal investigation, which involves initiating prosecutions against individuals, if she judges that the crimes alleged to have been committed are sufficiently grave. And as I'll show you, this gravity concept is a malleable concept, and I think it's allowed the court to be strategic in its choices about which cases to formally investigate. So I'll start talking a little bit about the cables now. So the ICC began operating in 2002. Unsurprisingly, I think for all of you, the neoconservatives in the Bush administration at the time were affronted, I think, by just the very existence of the court, because it could, albeit in limited circumstances, exercise jurisdiction over US nationals. So the individuals in the Bush administration, Bush himself, Cheney, Rumsfeld, they were obviously concerned that they could find themselves at the ICC at The Hague, being charged with war crimes in relation to the Iraq War, the war in Afghanistan, and the torture regime that they had overseen. More broadly, I think, they were concerned that the ICC could act as a fetter on US military power. So the Bush administration undertook a long and intense campaign to try to ensure that no US nationals could ever be prosecuted by the court. US diplomats around the world were instructed by Washington to pressure member states, ICC member states, into signing what's called bilateral immunity agreements. By these agreements, governments promised that they wouldn't hand over US nationals to the court without US consent. Countries which refused to sign these agreements would be subject to sanctions on US military aid and also other types of aid. And so this was a very powerful weapon in the hands of US diplomats to try to persuade governments to sign these agreements, giving US nationals immunity from the court's jurisdiction. So major non-NATO allies like Australia and Bahrain were exempt from these sanctions, but the cables show that they were still subject to pressure. In November 2006, a cable from Canberra reported that US diplomats had conveyed to DFAT officials, I quote, continued strong interest in Australia signing a bilateral immunity agreement, especially from Defence Secretary Donald Rumsfeld. So this cable was sent around the same time that lawyers in Germany were trying to bring a case against Rumsfeld and other Bush administration officials under that country's universal jurisdiction law. So the cables from this period show just how aggressively the Bush administration pursued the goal of immunity. The cables also display the variety of underhand tactics that US embassies employ in order to get their way. So bullying weaker states, threatening them, trying to bribe them with promises of aid. So this is the carrot and stick approach, as it's called by US diplomats, and this is a strategy that you see here, but you see in a lot of the other cables as well. And in some countries, you see a kind of divide and rule tactic being used as well. So US diplomats try to get members of the military of their host governments on side so that they would pressure their governments into signing the agreements in order to retain access to US military aid. So the US Embassy in Quito, Ecuador, for example, reported in 2004, we are not missing any opportunities to flog the military over the need for a bilateral immunity agreement. So 100 countries, around about 100 countries, were persuaded to sign these agreements. We don't really know for sure because lots of them were negotiated in secret. But this approach was gradually abandoned in Bush's second term because, as Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said in 2006, the sanctions on military aid were sort of the same as shooting ourselves in the foot. So several US diplomatic missions reported to Washington that the sanctions had hampered the United States war on terror and its war on drugs, and they were jeopardizing interoperability between the US and other nations, and they were costing the US influence in foreign militaries. US diplomats in countries such as Brazil and Ecuador reported their concern that their host governments were going to other nations for their military training, for example. A 2005 cable from the US Embassy in Quito reported that the sanctions were putting at risk our influence over an entire generation of officers. So that shows you how concerned the United States is still these days with maintaining influence in Latin American militaries. So since that period, the United States, under Bush and Obama, since this period of pursuing these agreements and really outright hostility towards the ICC, the United States has moved away more towards a position of selective support for the court. And I think this is partly because US fears about the ICC intruding into American-led conflicts have not materialised. So there's a terrific book on the ICC called Rough Justice, the International Criminal Court in a World of Power Politics. In this book, the author, American academic David Bosco, argues that there's been a process of mutual accommodation between major powers and the International Criminal Court. So he argues that the court has been subject to control behaviour by major powers, but also that the court itself has acted strategically to avoid confrontation with those powers. So, for example, the court has opened preliminary investigations into several situations, including Iraq, Afghanistan, Colombia and Palestine, but has not proceeded to formal investigations in any of those situations, all of which of course involve the United States, nor has it opened a full investigation into the 2008 Russia-Georgia war in order to avoid confrontation with Russia, I think. So most of the pressure, I think, on the ICC from the United States has been indirect, as I've just outlined, and there are only a few cables which report on meetings between representatives of the United States and ICC officials. But those cables do suggest that I think the court officials have been keen to get the Americans on side. So I'll just mention one now. After the US-led invasion of Iraq in March 2003, there was a lot of public speculation about whether the new court would investigate allegations of crimes relating to that war. So the court actually only has jurisdiction over crimes committed by an individual of a member state or on the territory of a member state. It's more complicated than that, but that's broadly its jurisdiction. So because neither Iraq nor the United States are members of the court, it doesn't have jurisdiction over the actions of US nationals in Iraq. However, it does have jurisdiction over the actions of forces from countries like the UK and Australia, which are members of the ICC. And I think the US would be strongly opposed to any ICC scrutiny of coalition activities in Iraq. So in July 2003, a cable from the US Embassy at The Hague reported that while there had been some public indications from court officials that they might open a formal investigation into the situation in Iraq, I quote, privately, ICC Chief Prosecutor Luis Moreno Ocampo has said that he wishes to dispose of the Iraq issue. The same cable reported that the court's registrar, Bruno Cafala, told the US Embassy that it was, I quote, crucial for the ICC to dispose of silly things like Iraq. Cafala told them, we're not going to run all over the world, and added that he personally wants relations with the US government to be smooth. So, yeah, I mean, if these quotes are accurate, and we can't always be sure that what is in the cables is accurate, then I guess it's pretty troubling because, you know, the ICC is supposed to be independent and impartial. The decisions of the prosecutor are supposed to be based on legal considerations alone. But here we have senior ICC officials telling the US that they'll stay away from investigating this conflict, which has claimed the lives of 1 million people. And so, yeah, and 3 years later, in 2006, the ICC Chief Prosecutor, Moreno Ocampo, did announce that while there was some evidence of war crimes committed by UK forces in Iraq, the offences were not grave enough to justify a full investigation. As I mentioned earlier, the gravity requirement in the Rome Statute gives the ICC prosecutor a wide discretion to decide which cases to formally investigate. In 2014, current ICC Chief Prosecutor Fatou Bensouda gave the same reason for declining to launch a formal investigation into the killing of 9 activists aboard the Mavi Marmara. As you probably know, the Mavi Marmara was part of the Freedom Flotilla which attempted to sail to Gaza in 2010. Bensouda found that while there was evidence that some war crimes had been committed aboard the Turkish ship, those offences were not grave enough to justify a formal investigation. So a full ICC investigation into that incident would have risked confrontation with the United States. And as the cables show us, the US has consistently sought to keep the actions of its ally Israel outside the court's jurisdiction. So for example, sorry, I'll just have a break. For example, there's a slew of cables which show how the US sought to blunt the effects of the 2009 Goldstone report into Operation Cast Lead. Blunt the effects, that's a quote from the cable, with the Americans boasting to the Israelis basically about how they managed to contain the damage from that report. So these cables show that the spectre of an ICC referral was one of the Obama administration's main concerns about the Goldstone report. The US diplomats were given orders by the State Department to lobby their host governments to vote against any resolutions at the UN which could lead to an ICC referral. And according to a cable from November 2009, US Ambassador to the United Nations, Susan Rice, issued a thinly veiled warning to the ICC president over the Goldstone report. Rice told him, I quote, "How the ICC handles issues concerning the Goldstone report will be perceived by many in the US as a test for the ICC, as this is a very sensitive matter." So, given the context of what I've talked about the way the Americans had really attacked the court, like I say, I think that can only really be viewed as a threat. But as I said, the US has softened its approach to the ICC in the last few years. I think this is partly because, as I said, the court hasn't challenged the superpower, but also because the United States has sought to instrumentalise the court, to use the court to further its foreign policy objectives. So, for example, in 2011, the Obama administration supported the UN Security Council referral of Libya to the International Criminal Court, basically in the hope that this would help expedite Muammar Gaddafi's removal from power. And they only supported this resolution after they'd carved out an exception for non-ICC member states in that resolution. So finally, I'll just say something about the cables about Sudan and the ICC, as they provide another good example of how the US and its allies have sought to instrumentalise the court. In July 2008, ICC Chief Prosecutor Moreno Ocampo announced that he was seeking a warrant for the arrest of Sudanese President Omar al-Bashir on charges of genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes relating to the conflict in Darfur. Under Article 16 of the Rome Statute, which created the court, the UN Security Council can defer ICC prosecutions for 12 months, and this deferral can be renewed. After the ICC indictment of Omar al-Bashir was announced, the cables show that the US, France and the UK tried to gain leverage over the Sudanese government by holding out the prospect of such a deferral of the indictment. So as I mentioned earlier, the ICC has only indicted Africans in its 13-year history, leading to accusations of neo-colonialism. I don't entirely agree with that, but you can certainly see a neo-colonial mentality coming across in the cables I'm about to mention. So a cable from the US Embassy in late 2008, from the US Embassy in Paris in late 2008 reported that representatives of President Sarkozy had told senior Sudanese officials that France couldn't promise to deliver an Article 16 deferral of the Bashir indictment. However, if the government of Sudan changed its behaviour, it could, and I'm quoting now, work its way into the world's good graces. According to the cable, the French had used the example of Gaddafi to try and encourage the Sudanese, and I quote, "who was once near the top of the world's bad guy list. However, he changed his ways and has slowly emerged from his isolation as a pariah with a recent visit to France, and now the prospect of a visit by Secretary Rice as well." So, of course, it's the prerogative of the imperial power of the United States to decide who are the good guys and who are the bad guys at any given time. And 3 years after this cable was sent, NATO bombs destroyed Libya, Gaddafi was captured and executed, and US Secretary of State Hillary Clinton boasted, "We came, we saw, he died." Finally, just one more cable as well, which I think illustrates this point. A cable from Khartoum reported that French Foreign Minister Bernard Kouchner had given the Sudanese a stiff talking to for refusing to cooperate with the ICC. According to the cable, he told them, I quote, "Who does al-Bashir think he is? President Bush? There's only one superpower. We have to accept that America ignores the ICC, but we won't accept it from you." So if this quote is accurate, I think it's a frank acknowledgement by the French Foreign Minister of the double standard which allows powerful states like the United States to exempt themselves from international criminal law, while others are expected to comply. I note that the US government has already stated that it will oppose any attempts to refer the recent bombing of a hospital in Kunduz in Afghanistan to the ICC. I think this asymmetry of power, as evidenced in the cables that I've mentioned, is the reason why the ICC cannot achieve its aim of ending impunity for war crimes and crimes against humanity and deterring those crimes. As long as might makes right, I think the court won't be able to achieve those aims. More fundamentally, I think that it's misguided just to look at international law and courts to solve the problem of war crimes and atrocities. I think if we want to do that, we need to look at the causes of wars and conflicts. And if we want to talk about justice, we need to look beyond the narrow concept of justice envisioned by the International Criminal Court. So I'll just end with a quote. This is from a statement of the South African Institute for Justice and Reconciliation, which I think speaks to these points. The international justice architecture cannot exist in an unequal world system that privileges the global north at the expense of the global south and still purport to be described as truly international. The individualised accountability envisioned by the ICC must be seen as a tool within a broader range of measures which pursues meaningful justice only as a precursor to remaking the global order and in tandem with measures that address victims and beneficiaries of structural oppression, both historically and today.